Let's talk about a story that's been circulating. It's largely been ignored by mainstream media, and that's reporting from investigative journalist Greg Palast, who has been an investigative journalist for 25 years, has broke some major stories on both ends of the political spectrum, also non-political stories. He does great groundwork. He has no political or partisan affiliation. You can literally go back to his reporting as far back as 1998 and recount 25 years of him equally reporting on both sides and even non-political stories. But what is pertinent to the story we're going to cover today is Greg Palast finds and pretty thoroughly lays out the case for how Kamala would have won the 2024 election if not for mass voter suppression, something Democrats have been clamoring about for decades now, has kind of fallen out of the mainstream of their discourse about elections. I think because Trump overtook that with fraud claims and their position came more about dismantling fraud claims than talking about voter suppression and voters being disenfranchised, which to me, it kind of makes sense why Republicans were pushing this landslide narrative about their victory so hard when it was really easily disprovable. Because if they can just get most people to think that and just not look into it at all, it would seem like, well, the country just shifted this way rather than any potentially shady actions that might have shifted the election one way or the other. And if it did, then it would have minimal effects, right? However, when you realize that Trump won less than a majority of the votes in this country, he had the fourth smallest popular vote victory margin in history of our elections, and the margin of victory in most swing states is lower than the amount of legal voters suppressed, the pieces begin to come together of kind of what happened here. So we're going to look over this article and provide some numbers and context. Feel free to check it out yourself, as it's a great read. It's highly sourced. It's not conspiratorial like you see a lot of the MAGA things about voter fraud and all these dead people who didn't vote. He's literally using data sourced from governmental agencies, from state agencies, citing exact laws and the effects that they would have. It's a really informative read. So we're going to jump into this. And when we're covering it, I want you to remember the idea is that it's not to do what MAGA did the last 4 years and indulge in conspiracies and fraudulent electors and 60 court cases to overturn the results or whatever, but to sound the alarm now so we can get out in front of it and trying to get a lot of these laws overturned before the next election cycle, even 2026 and 2028, to where there's fair shakes on both sides and we can overturn the fascism that we've just blatantly seen. So hopping in, it's on his website, Greg Palast. Again, we're not going to read every word of this. Feel free to check it out on your own. We're just going to cover some of the big points, I thought. The first one is that from his calculations, what he found essentially is that Harris would have gained at least, and we'll get into how this is the minimal number. This is like the conservative, all things considered, because obviously all votes that suppressed when it went to Harris. So the minimal number is that Harris would have gained at least 3.5 million more votes. That would have topped Trump's official popular vote tally by 1.3 million. So as we go through this, he recounts the different ways that this is laid out. Some of the key numbers: 4.7 million, a little over 4.7 million voters were wrongfully purged from voter rolls, according to the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission data. I'll have it on the screen. Again, this is publicly sourced data. By August of 2024, for the first time since 1946, self-proclaimed vigilante voter fraud hunters challenged the rights of over 300,000 voters. The NAACP of Georgia estimates that by election day, the challenge exceeded 200,000 Georgians in Georgia alone. Trump's margin of victory in Georgia was just over like 100,000. So speaks there. No less than over 2 million mail-in ballots were disqualified for minor clerical errors. As we'll get into, this also disproportionately seems to affect people of color. He just talks about all the different ballots that were disqualified, provisional ballots that were rejected. Again, as we'll get into, disproportionately affects voters of color, to where you can kind of see the schemes and the way this was put in place to disenfranchise a very specific type of voter, right? So if the purges, challenges, and ballot rejections were random, it wouldn't matter. It's anything but random, though. For example, an audit, and I will show this audit on the screen as well, an audit by the state of Washington found that a black voter was 400% more likely than a white voter to have their mail-in ballot rejected. Rejection of black in-person votes, according to a U.S. Civil Rights Commission study in Florida, ran 14.3%, or 1 in 7 ballots cast. This is compared to 1.6% for white voters. Again, all publicly available information from independent, nonpartisan institutions, organizations. The nasty little secret of, so according to the Brennan Center for Justice, since the 2020 election, at least 30 states have enacted 78 restrictive laws to blockade voting. on my Substack, first link in my description. I think we're going to go through, probably spend a week or so going through and covering some of these. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. The biggest thing to take from here is that if you look at the map on what states that pass these restrictive laws, it almost 1-to-1 matches up with Trump's electoral victory map. There's just like a couple outliers like Wisconsin and Michigan, but outside of that, pretty clear where Trump saw the most benefits, or who these laws benefited more, I should say. In Harris County, Texas, during COVID, there were the mail-in ballots. I mean, this happened in all the states, the mail-in ballots being sent out. In Texas, however, the state's attorney general sought to block these efforts, right? Well, he then went on Steve Bannon's podcast and proudly stated, had he not blocked the mail-in ballots because they disproportionately favored Democrats, Donald Trump would have lost the election in Texas, in deep red Texas. So just think, if Trump would have lost in Texas due to mail-in ballots being allowed or not blocked, how would this affect swing states where the margins are a lot closer? Texas' requirement to add ID numbers to absentee ballots caused the rejection rate to jump up just from 1% to 12%. In 2020, an NPR study found the mail-in ballot rejection rate hit almost 14% just during Democratic primaries. And when you get into the reasons why these rejections were happening is when it becomes kind of sinister. As we scroll down here, where does it get to? Oh yeah, even if deemed on time, even if the ballots are turned in on time, they're followed all the structural guidelines, they could still face rejection for reasons as simple as first-time voter Adrian Conasseri Jr. told me his mail-in ballot was rejected because his signature supposedly didn't match that was on his registration. In effect, Consineri, sorry if I'm mispronouncing his last name, was accused of forgery, which is a federal crime. Sounds pretty serious, right? I mean, the FBI accused him of forgery, right? So obviously, I mean, this guy's ballot was blocked for a reason until you learn that he wasn't accused of it by the FBI. No charges were ever brought against him for this. He was accused of it by self-appointed amateur sleuths, of which Georgia state law now allows them to challenge the ballots of people on grounds like this, and it could lead to them getting denied for nothing other than, oh, well, your signature here was more sloppy and it was neat here. In 2020, the federal government reported that 157,000 ballots were rejected for this mismatched type of signatures. That's a crime wave, but without criminals, as Greg Palast states, because when you look into the numbers, nobody is getting charged with crimes for this. It's just accusations that literally never have any merit to them, yet it still gets your ballot disqualified. The crucial statistic is that not everyone's ballot gets disqualified. One study done for the United States Civil Rights Commission found that a Black person, such as those mentioned earlier, will be 900% more likely to have their mail-in ballot or in-person ballot disqualified than a white voter. Again, we'll show this data on the screen. Now, let's do some arithmetic. If we take the lowest end of the MIT ballot rejection rate and only a tenth of the lost ballot rate. So these are super conservative measurements here. If he was being generous, it would be a lot higher. If he was even taking the standard or what would be expected, it would be a lot higher. But to be very, very conservative as to cast aside any doubt that could be had, 2.1 million mail-in ballots into the electoral dumpster. Democrats are 51% more likely than Republicans to vote by mail. And given the racial disparity, the 4 times more likely for it to happen to Black voters, 14 times more likely in person to happen to Black voters, in some states 9 times more likely, it becomes clear which voting demographic this is going to affect a little bit more. So another thing that is important to note about this, as Greg Palast points out, is that a lot of these laws or these programs that Republicans are using to implement these methods and these means come from KKK era times in which they would use these largely to just disenfranchise Black votes. And they're bringing them back because that's a good idea, I guess. So one challenged voter, Major Turner, the same voter whose mail-in ballot was disqualified in the later election. In 2020, the Major's ballot was challenged by the county chairman of the Republican Party in Southern Georgia, Alton Russell. Russell likes to just not important to the thing. In a polite confrontation we filmed between the Major and the Russell, Greg Palast caught this on camera. The GOP honcho admitted that he had no evidence to even challenge this person's ballot, nor any of the 4,000 others he had challenged. When Palast contacted or I guess, took a sample of the votes, it found that overwhelmingly they were people of color as well. Again, in 2020, the KKK plan adopted by the Trump organization proved its value. In that election, Trump almost won Georgia, falling short by just almost 12,000 votes, only because of local elections. They rejected most of the challenges. However, in 2024, they'd already challenged a mind-blowing 317,000 votes just by August. By November, election day, they had challenged over 2 million votes. Remember, in Georgia alone, the margin was like just over 100,000. In Wisconsin, the margin was like just over 10,000, I think. In Michigan, the tally was like just over 100,000. These are relatively close margins when we're talking about what decides a state, especially when the margins of voter suppression typically then outweigh them. What seems to be the most damning way that they go about doing this is something called the poison postcard. Essentially, state officials send out postcards to residents. If residents don't respond to the postcard, then they're deemed as having moved, possibly, so their votes could be disqualified. Going name by name through Georgia's purge list, for instance, working from special data provided by the U.S. Postal Services, again, all publicly available data, identified 198,000 Georgians who had been purged for moving due to not replying to this postcard. However, they had not moved an inch. The only evidence that they had that they had moved was they didn't reply to the postcard. He testified in 2020 in front of a court that those most likely to be affected by this are minorities and young people, both of which disproportionately vote Democrat. According to EAC data before the 2024 election, over 4.7 million registrants were removed nationwide simply because they hadn't returned the postcard. Again, something that disproportionately affects Black voters. Before the 2024 election, the poison postcard accelerated. This time, a new elections board in Wisconsin decided to use the same discredited purge list to knock off over 166,000 votes. Kamala lost the state by under 30,000. Pennsylvania wiped out 360,000. Trump won the state by like 100-something thousand. It's pretty substantial margins we're talking about here. We're not talking about 10 or 11 people. We're talking about hundreds of thousands in states that were won by fractions of those. And again, what I said we were going to get to when you look at down here, as he explains, no less. The number he's citing here is no less than 3.5 million. Harris would have topped Trump's official total by 1.2 million if this was true. The least plausible explanation, or the least amount. As he pretty clearly explains here, that he has to recognize that some voters caught in the purges would have casted their ballot for Trump, so he conservatively cuts in half the low end of the range of calculation and then suppressed it to 2.3% to isolate the effect on Trump's official victory margin to best calculate the possibility of what would have been Harris voters. So no less than 3.5 million, could have been more like 5, 6, 7 million. And when you take, if it was like 5, 6, 7 million, Harris repeats the Biden numbers, then again, a lot of these things that had us all calling questions kind of make a bit more sense as more information begins to come out.